Good afternoon, and welcome to day 8 of the Legal Grounds 12 Days of Christmas. Today, I want to talk about something that I've seen coming up in a lot of consultations that I'm having. And that is this, is that many people, because of the pandemic and because of the economy, they are wondering how they can file a lawsuit without having money. And quite frankly, I have a lot of people asking me if they can force the other side to cover the costs. And that is not quite how it works when you file a lawsuit. So, in other words, you may eventually ask the other side and have the judge ask the judge to have the other side pay for your costs, but you have to deal with the costs one way or another up front when you decide to file a lawsuit. So, there are really two ways of doing this whenever you file a lawsuit in Texas. One is that you simply pay the court costs. Just keep in mind that normally is the other side is not willing to do what's called a waiver of service, and I can do a whole nother video on that, but that's basically a document that says they're willing to accept the lawsuit petition and then sign a waiver so that you don't have to actually serve them by a private process server or constable. If they're not willing to do that, then you have to pay court costs, the filing fees, plus you have to pay the fees for serving the defendant with the lawsuit. So that's the traditional route, is to go ahead and pay for it and ask for those costs to be part of the judgment. The second way, and quite frankly, the way I wanted to discuss today, is that you can do what's called an affidavit of indigency or an affidavit of inability to pay court costs. Most courts, most clerks will have these forms available if you don't know how to prepare one. A lot of the justice of the peace courts will have these forms available already. Some of the county and district court clerks may have those. But basically, what an affidavit of inability to pay court costs is that it's an affidavit stating that you do not have enough money given your income and expenses and assets to pay for the court costs. And you're asking the court clerk to accept the lawsuit for free, basically, waiving the cost. And you have to be able to provide information to back that up. Most of these affidavits are going to have spaces to do an income, what's your monthly income. You have to list what your expenses are. You also have to list what assets you have. It doesn't have to be like totally detailed, but you have to give enough information so that the court clerk or later the judge can decide based upon that information whether or not to allow you to get that case for free without having to pay those court costs. The big thing about court costs doing that affidavit of inability is even though the clerk may take that lawsuit for free without you paying any money up front, the defendant has the ability to challenge that affidavit and ask for a hearing before the judge whenever the defendant gets into the case to see whether or not you really are indigent and thus whether or not the judge should force you to pay those fees. So even though you get those fees free up front, that affidavit can be challenged. And if the judge decides, you could potentially be forced to pay those fees later if the judge decides that you're not really indigent and you actually do have enough money that you could have paid those court costs. If the judge makes that decision, you will get a deadline by which to make that payment. And if you don't make that payment, then you could potentially have the case thrown out for lack of paying those filing fees. In addition to the defendant challenging the court costs, the judge could potentially do it on his or her own as well. If the judge determines through going through the case and what he or she hears in hearings and emotions that you may have some money, then the judge could sue, what's called sua sponte, on his or her own, have a hearing on whether or not those court costs should be paid for. So if you're somebody that makes some money and you're just trying to save on court costs, even though you could potentially file it for free with an affidavit, you need to be wary because you are filing an affidavit under oath. And if the judge finds out that you misrepresented your financial status just to get free filing fees, not only could you be forced to pay those filing fees, you'll also lose credibility with the judge, and potentially there could be some ramifications for you lying on the document submitted to the court. So if you really can't afford the filing fees, then you can go ahead and file an affidavit of indigency or an affidavit of inability to pay costs and potentially get those costs set aside so that you can file and move on with your lawsuit. Just beware that the judge or the defendant could potentially challenge that. But assuming it's not challenged or assuming that the challenge is denied, then you can potentially file a lawsuit in Texas without having to pay those fees. But don't expect to go up to the court and just ask for a free lawsuit. You're going to have to file that affidavit. Again, most courts have that form, and you have to be willing to share your financial information so that others can determine whether or not you really do have meet the requirements to not be able to afford those filing fees. I hope this has been helpful. Just know that if you're coming up on a statute of limitations deadline or deadline to file that lawsuit and you don't have the money, there is a way to actually file that lawsuit on time and then deal with the costs later if you really don't have the money. Again, I would urge you not to lie on that affidavit and come back and to haunt you in many ways. But there is a way to do it. This is Benjamin Sanchez. I'm a Houston attorney. My number is 713-780-7745. You can find me on sanchezlawfirm.com. Day 8 of the Legal Grounds 12 Days of Christmas. I look forward to concluding this video series on Christmas Day. And I actually have a special live video planned for that particular day. Hope you all have a good Christmas week, and I will see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.